we've had the GLP-1 agonists, which have shown that they provide some weight loss, and not without some shortcomings. I'll definitely mention, but why don't we talk about that? The GLP-1s. I mean, I think a lot of the focus is on how great they are and how they can kind of solve everything. But what are some of the primary shortcomings of GLP-1s? I mean, off the top of my head is, one is the expense, and two is that you need to maintain taking them to have the effect. It's not like something where you take it, solves a problem, then you can go off of them. What are your guys' thoughts there on some of the shortcomings of the GLP-1 space?
Bryan, I'll let you lead on this one.
I think that definitely kind of the maintenance portion of it is something that we're seeing as being more difficult. It's not necessarily a drug that you can just take it for a year and then forget about it. And so that's definitely kind of a question mark. I think also interestingly, there really hasn't been we're seeing kind of a divergence in terms of efficacy and exploration of dosages. So interestingly, with the Kagrasima results that we saw a few weeks ago now, or I guess we saw the headline results about 2 months ago from Novo Nordisk, but they just last week kind of broke out the dose cohorts there with actually increasing interesting results, kind of showing that actually lower doses had a increased efficacy. And so I think that, while these drugs are really impressive in terms of what they've been able to accomplish, there's definitely a lot more to go in just even refining the existing drugs and the dosage strategies there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so certainly seen that. So on all of the products, ours included dose titration, dose management is become more and more important. And so I obviously sell a product, Qsymia, in this space, and we compete, and we also cooperate with the GLP-1s. So we've been informed by a number of physicians who utilize both drugs to actually help manage patients. And what I think, the most important thing is that there's a number of products now that allow a patient to get to a new weight, that lose weight, and they're all very effective and have varying degrees of efficacy and speed to their weight loss. But the muscle wasting is an important matter that needs to be addressed. So bone density is an important matter that needs to be addressed. And from my perspective, as Vivus, I don't think, each of the individual pharmaceutical companies does their own trial work and that's really focused on their own individual drug. I think the thing that needs to happen now is you need to build a protocol, the industry, along with maybe academics and the physician and the care community, need to build a protocol that kind of says, okay, well, if you're this type of patient, here's the best protocol for you to achieve durable, healthy weight loss. And then there's another protocol that needs to be established, and there needs to be some patient segmentation. We've become much, much more intelligent over the last 4 or 5 years as GLP-1s have come to market. And as, I always say November 2022, when Elon Musk said, I'm taking Ozempic to lose weight, that was the first time that somebody actually, arguably the smartest man in the world, said, hey, I'm utilizing pharmaceuticals to lose weight. And that was a transformative statement, for the planet. And it was actually, it was wonderful, I think, for everybody's business. But probably most important, it was wonderful for patients because now patients actually have a broader tool set than just purely diet and exercise coupled with frustration. I think the last point I want to make is that, with the new chairman of HHS, potentially, was he approved? I'm
Yeah.
not sure. I'm involved. Yeah, so he's approved, and I think he's got some great ideas around, weight loss. But from an epidemiology perspective, the human population kind of breaks into two large buckets as it relates to obesity. There's people who can manage their weight with purely diet and exercise, and then the other half of the population can't, and they need some help. And I think that, the acceptance around those two blocks of population now is much higher than it ever has been. and people understand that much better now. And so over the next 5 to 10 years, I think the development of these kind of concomitant therapy protocols will be a focus of the industry. And we're certainly going to do that. So we're going to sponsor, physicians in 5 or 6 different countries across the globe and basically build a 3-arm trial. Here's a GLP-1 with Qsymia, and Qsymia alone. And that will allow people to understand what durable, healthy weight loss looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll stop there. I got some other stuff to bring up, but I'll stop there.
I was going to say, interestingly, kind of with what John was saying with the different protocols, is what we've seen kind of consistently with the GLP-1s, both with the REDEFINE trial with CagriSema, as well as the SURMOUNT trial with Zepbound, in the actual efficacy of the BMI cohorts. And so you're seeing, decent efficacy in, BMI under 30 or 30 through 35. The highest efficacy from 35 to 40, but you actually then see the efficacy drop off for a BMI of greater than 40, which really kind of speaks to needing to do more research into these individual patient cohorts and personalizing the treatment more for that.
Yeah. It's one of the things that, our product is used by a lot of bariatric surgeons. So they use our product pre-bariatric surgery and post-bariatric surgery. And we did a study with Wake Forest, which I thought was fascinating because the patients their BMIs were 45 to 60. So, people who are certainly class 3 obesity. And the patients who are on pharmaceutical plus bariatric surgery, they've finally rested at BMIs of about 30 on average. And then the patients who didn't take drug and who just had surgery, their BMIs ended up around 40. And so it was a fairly substantial difference. And so how you treat a class 3 obese person versus how you treat somebody who's just overweight versus class 1 versus class 2, that work needs to be done. And the goal shouldn't be just achieving a weight loss goal for this one single moment in time, but it needs to be like, here's how you're going to live your life, post this, significant weight loss that you go through as a result of these drugs. We're really seeing that in Europe. So the Europeans are taking a very different approach to weight loss versus what happens in the United States. We expect that the Middle East will have an even different approach because of how they eat food, how they rest during the day. Ramadan weighs into it, how they manage Ramadan. So it's these individual populations. The drugs all work in them, but how the physicians treat the patients and how the patients eat and diet and exercise, it's all different. And so that research needs to be done. So I'm really excited about seeing us progress through all of that, because the goal is to end obesity, not just get somebody to lose weight at a point in time.
Right. Yeah, the combination therapy, I think that's one of the big themes, I think, throughout a lot of different areas.
Absolutely.
Another area where the GLP-1s are trying to make some headway is to convert to an oral form.
Mm-hmm.
Right now it's an injection. And that can be inconvenient. People don't like needles.
Right.
And there are a number of efforts being made to find oral version. There is one, Novo's Rybelsus, but I don't think it's used very widely, and it requires a lot of drug. I've heard up to 100 times the amount of drug required in a Rybelsus tablet than's required for an injection. So that's just not very efficient, right? Especially when we may or may not have shortages in the drug. You don't want to waste it on one dose. And I actually have a company that I'm working on, a couple companies that are working on oral versions of the GLP-1s to address that convenience issue. And it also, I think if you're able to get an oral form, you can actually, you could dose it daily and perhaps get a little bit better performance from the drug because, you don't have those peaks and valleys that you have when you're periodically injected. So, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the importance of an oral form. And John, you have an oral form of your weight loss drug, right? So you're already addressed that. But, if you go into combination with the GLP-1s, you have to get an injection and then, take the pill, which is the easiest part of it. What do you guys think about the consumer demand for a an oral version of this weight loss product?
Yeah, so based on our research, and this is really whether it's a type 2 diabetic or just an obese patient. So you kind of have to break those two populations in and separate them because their behaviors are different.
Hmm.
People who are just obese, they really just want an oral solid. That's kind of, once a day pill, once a week pill, whatever it is. They really don't want to have the injection. And if you look at the GLP-1 utilization, over half of it drops off within 6 months. So it's just, it's gone. And then most of those people have a weight rebound. If somebody can get the dosing proper and it can actually, get you into a smaller pill, and then I think, the GLP-1s will be successful. I think that's a harder problem than people, you know, truly understand. But we'll see. The research will move through, and we'll see what happens. But if Novo Nordisk couldn't really figure it out with Rybelsus, I'm not sure some of these other smaller companies are going to be able to sort it out. But the application of AI might unlock something that we haven't found yet.
Yeah, and interestingly, so last week Novo actually, now with the Oasis 4 results back in October, in their most recent earnings call, Novo said that they expect to file Rybelsus for obesity in the U.S. within this quarter. So that indication should be coming later this year. But that being said, they also said that they don't expect this to be, the solution for obesity worldwide. And I think that's a combination both of the amount of API or active pharmaceutical ingredient within the medication and the cost of that to manufacture, but also in terms of the efficacy. While significantly easier to take that medicine, it is less efficacious than subcutaneous administration methods.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And, Bryan, you and I were talking about a couple oral forms that are in development now. I think Lilly has one, and then you mentioned amycretin, I believe, which had some trial readouts. You have any thoughts on those? And I think some of those are small molecules, so they don't even need to be kind of reformulated to become, an oral version. What are your
So
thoughts
I think
about
a
that?
lot of them they're not necessarily small molecule, but they're similar molecules to what we're already seeing. And then I know with amycretin, which is Novo's most recent kind of readout, they read out data for subcutaneous results, but it's also being explored as a oral pill as well. So we do know with the subcutaneous results that showed very strong weight loss. I think they hit 22% at 28 weeks. And
Wow.
so very, very strong weight loss there. But, in terms of its ability to perform similarly with oral, that remains to be seen. And I don't think we've seen numbers from there. And then with Lilly, I think you have, I'm going to 100% say this wrong. It is Ola.
Yeah, I forget the name of that.
Yeah, it's a nice long one.
Yeah.
But so that one I believe is actually in phase 3 for them, versus Novo's amycretin with their subcutaneous version just actually read out phase 1B, 2A. So definitely earlier in development there and a little bit further away. But I think you are definitely seeing the more on market GLP-1s right now, and in kind of very similar molecules. Those are being converted to oral dosages and are kind of later in the pipeline. So those should be available quicker. It's really just a question of, in terms of efficacy, they're going to be less efficacious, and so that might not work as well for higher BMI groups that are really needing to reduce weight by a higher percentage. And then in addition to that, obviously the API production, the ability to maintain supply there is really a concern. I mean, Novo has tripled their GLP-1 API capacity, manufacturing capacity over the past 3 years. And even still, they're warning about potential for shortages during this year. So,
Right.
Yeah. And, we've got, we mentioned this a little bit earlier. We're talking a little bit about international weight loss. It might be a little bit different than in the United States. I think the epidemic isn't as bad overseas as it is in the United States. But John, you're
Depends
starting
on where you
to
go.
expand. What was that?
It depends on which country you go to.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they're all quite different.
Right.
and I think the United States probably stands out as being more different yet. But what are some of the different approaches that can be used to address weight loss outside the United States? And John, I think you actually have better patent protection overseas in the United States for Qsymia, and I think you call it something else. Well, you do call it something else outside the
Yeah.
United States. What, maybe touch on that for a bit and tell us about kind of the ex-US plan.
Yeah, so when you think about so our drug is called Qseva overseas, except in Greece where it'll be called Qsymia. Um, and actually in the Middle East it'll still be called Qsymia. It, there really is, this cultural attachment to food that's different and exercise in each of these geographies. So and that's something that needs to be considered. Like for example, in the Middle East, in Dubai and the UAE, Saudi, you don't need a prescription for a GLP-1. You can just walk into the pharmacy and actually get the
Hmm.
drug. And physicians actually have a very tough time with that because without the education around the side effect profile, you end
Hmm.
up with patients with very significant GI issues. When you
Hmm.
talk to an obesity physician in the United States, they titrate even more slowly, going to the up dose and very rarely actually get to high dose of the two predominant GLP-1s, in tirzepatide or in Zepbound and Wegovy. And so their dosing is different. We're seeing that overseas as well. The Middle East probably has supplanted the United States as the leader in the obesity epidemic, particularly with pediatrics. And so pediatric obesity is a very significant issue in the Middle East. And if you look at the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, if you look at the Emirates of the UAE, they're very focused on how to solve that issue, how to mitigate that issue. They eat dinner, around 10 o'clock at night, 9 o'clock at night, and it's a very carb heavy diet. And so eating that much food that late at night is very much part of their religion, very much part of their family experience. And that's been, driving, obesity over there. And then when you go to Europe, if you go to the United Kingdom or Ireland, they have a very different attachment to food, very different carbohydrate intake than you do in Finland or Denmark or Iceland. So each of the locales has a different approach. And so we're getting smarter about that. And I think, obviously Novo has a huge head start on us, with their overseas operations, but I'm sure Lilly's going through a similar type of, learning experience as rapidly as they can. So, each of those experiences are going to be tailored to those individual, countries. And then I think the other thing too is that, the bulk of obesity meds, both domestically here in the United States and even overseas in socialized medicine states, it's still out of pocket expense. So
Hmm.
everybody's paying cash. In Norway, Sweden, some of the other examples, if the person has a BMI of 35 or higher and they failed, diet and exercise, then their drug will be reimbursed. But it's a much more price sensitive marketplace overseas, particularly in Europe, versus the United States.
Yeah. And Bryan, what do you guys think about, regionally? I mean, obviously the United States is the most important market, for these products, for this class of product. What, from an investment standpoint, how do you think about it?
So I think one of the big things that we've looked at is particularly, within Europe with nationalized healthcare systems and the choice to reimburse these medications. That's definitely been an area of focus for us in terms of, determining whether or not these companies, and specifically Novo, but now Lilly as they're going to market, are able to convince these national healthcare systems that reimbursing these medications is eventually cost effective for them.
Mhm.
Ultimately 5, 10 years down the line, that your overall healthcare burden and cost from cardiovascular events is going to be reduced by so much by reimbursing these medications that it makes sense for the upfront payment now. And I think we're seeing kind of a similar amount of hesitancy in the US as well, and definitely more I would say more hesitancy within the US, given that it's not a fully nationalized healthcare system.
Right.
And so it really isn't being compared on a like for like basis in terms of really assessing those ultimate costs 5, 10 years from now.
Yeah.
Because ultimately the government won't have to bear 100% of cardiac bypass surgeries.
Mhm.
But I think it's still a similar decision, and I think that's really been very large for us in looking at those reimbursement rates. That's why, initially a year and a half ago, when the Select CV trial came out with Wegovy in terms of reducing the adverse cardiovascular events, that was really exciting for us because that really provided a clear line of sight to demonstrate that these medications really can improve long-term health outcomes and actually save healthcare systems money as well.
Yeah. Well, that kind of is a good transition into one of the other topics I wanted to address was the broad range of indications where GLP-1s will work, because we probably both remember in November, Zepbound was
Mhm.
approved for, or maybe it was December, it was approved for sleep apnea by the FDA, which
Right.
was the first new indication, I think, after weight loss and diabetes. But there's been a lot of discussion about potentially other indications as well that can be helped. And, Bryan, you mentioned the cardiovascular benefits. I've seen Alzheimer's disease is another one. There are a lot of comorbidities with obesity that exist out there. And, a couple questions I thought we could address on this. One, I think a lot of people wonder if, there's some other mechanism of action of the drug that helps with sleep apnea, but I think it's directly related to, and they say this actually in the FDA approval, that it's directly related to weight loss, right?
Mhm.
So the benefit that you get with your sleep apnea is related to your lower weight, not related to directly that Zepbound is helping you reduce your sleep apnea. And then I think the same thing is true with others. And is that what you're seeing as well in the research, that
So
it's directly related to the weight?
I would just kind of add on to that question for John, but also seeing with the Wegovy flow trial in terms of patients with CKD and reducing renal failure rates as well. And that's going to be, I expect, kind of the next major indication for GLP-1s. I believe that indication expansion or label expansion has been filed at this point too. So.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you go back and look at the history of our drug, it had tremendous efficacy in sleep apnea. But we were never able to make that claim. We never actually ran that through a trial. We just had, instructive data, I should say. And when we certainly don't market the product, as a sleep apnea solution, it is, just purely in the indication of obesity, trying to make sure I don't get in trouble. Um, but, but ultimately, I think if you look at the comorbidity profile of a patient who has a BMI of 35 or higher, they have cardiovascular, they have musculoskeletal, they have sleep apnea, and they have higher rates of cancer. And all of that gets modified. All of those risks get modified if you move them to a healthy weight. So really kind of in terms of understanding, um, I'll tell you a story. I had a conversation with a very, very large self-insured employer, 300,000 plus people, and they were asking us about obesity, and we're having a fairly comprehensive conversation about it. And their question was, okay, I'm going to spend all of this money for a GLP-1. These patients are going to use it for 6 months, 7 months. They're going to gain all their weight back. And then I don't have any of that long-term benefit. And so the question that they were posing to me is, how do we ensure that our patient population and the associated family members are going to have long-term durable healthy weight loss? So we actually get that benefit. And so we're doing a study with Milliman Group, and Milliman Group's performing the study for us. And really what we're looking at is, okay, if you don't have to take hypertensive drugs for the rest of your life, or blood pressure lowering meds or statins or any of those other products, if we truly modify the curve on oncology expenditures, bariatric surgery. But here's the replacement cost. The replacement cost isn't 6 months of drugs, it's 6 months or plus to get you to the healthy weight, plus whatever it is to have maintenance drug over the longitudinal axis of that patient's lifespan while they're being covered by you. And that becomes the actual mathematical and actuarial formula that needs to be understood. And that's not yet. And so whether it's sleep apnea, renal failure, oncology, cardiovascular, whatever it is, in order for, whether it's state-funded, socialized medicine, or self-insured employer, they all have to answer that actuarial question, and that data is not available yet. So we're in the process of trying to produce that.
So, John, that brings up an interesting question, which is perhaps it makes sense to use the GLP-1s and Qsymia to get you down to your target weight. And due to the cost of the GLP-1s, I mean, does it make sense to use Qsymia to maintain that weight? Because the hard part is probably getting it down. What's your thought about that?
Yeah, so it kind of goes back to my earlier comment around this concomitant therapy of determining the proper protocol to create that long-term durable weight loss. We have patients who've been on Qsymia for 8 years. They'll take it, anecdotally, they'll take the drug every other day, that type of thing. And but that's in a conversation with their physician, and the physician and their patient go through a process to determine how to manage, their weight, on a long-term basis. We certainly think that that's an option. We certainly believe that it needs to be studied. We know that patients, like diabetic patients who suffer from obesity will take Wegovy or Ozempic, and then titrate their dose down to manage their weight more effectively. Mm-hmm. So that's an effective strategy. So it kind of goes back to, phenotyping, genotyping of patients, figuring out what type of patient you are. But my hope as somebody who's very passionate about solving the obesity epidemic and giving people really long-term durable options is let's do some more research. Let's put these drugs together. Let's run some global trials. Let's take into account localized diet. Let's take into account localized sleep, localized exercise, excuse me. And once we do that work, we can be much more instructive to the payer community, to the physician community, and the patient community to make their best choices.